There's a specific, predictable miscalculation that narcissists make almost every single time they cross a super empath, and it's precisely this miscalculation that eventually costs them everything they thought they'd secured permanently. Today, I want to walk you through exactly what this mistake is, why it happens so consistently despite how catastrophic its consequences tend to be, and why the specific combination of qualities that defines a super empath makes this particular error uniquely, irreversibly costly in a way it simply isn't with other kinds of partners. To understand this mistake fully, you first have to understand the fundamental assumption a narcissist typically operates under when interacting with anyone in their life, an assumption that works reasonably well with most people, but fails catastrophically, eventually, with this specific type of person. That assumption is this: that emotional intensity and volume are the primary indicators of how seriously a violation will be taken, and that the absence of loud, immediate, dramatic reaction means the violation itself carries limited weight or consequence. This assumption develops because it's largely accurate with most people. Most partners, most friends, most family members, when genuinely hurt, express that hurt fairly immediately and fairly visibly through anger, through tears, through confrontation, through some observable escalation that gives the narcissist real-time feedback about how seriously their behavior is landing. A super empath, however, operates according to an entirely different internal architecture, one a narcissist consistently, predictably fails to understand until it's far too late to matter. The specific mistake is this: narcissists consistently mistake a super empath's calm, measured response to being hurt for evidence that the hurt wasn't actually significant, when in reality that calm exterior is often concealing something far more consequential than visible anger ever could. A quiet, internal, permanent recalibration of trust that doesn't require external drama to be completely real and completely final. This is the miscalculation that destroys these relationships almost every single time, because the narcissist keeps testing boundaries based on inaccurate feedback, genuinely believing, based on the absence of dramatic external reaction, that they haven't yet reached anything resembling a real limit, when the limit was actually reached and processed internally long before any visible sign of it ever became apparent. The first thing worth understanding about why this specific miscalculation happens so consistently is the fundamental difference between how a super empath processes violation compared to how most people process it. Most people's emotional processing happens largely externally. They feel hurt, and that hurt gets expressed relatively immediately, relatively visibly, because the processing itself is happening in real time, in the moment, often before full reflection has had the chance to occur. A super empath's processing, by contrast, tends to happen through a much more internal, much more deliberate mechanism, precisely because of the combination of deep emotional attunement and genuine self-possession that defines this specific psychological profile. She feels the hurt just as intensely, sometimes more intensely, given her heightened capacity for emotional experience, but the processing of that hurt happens through internal reflection rather than immediate external display, which means the narcissist, watching for the external signals he's learned to interpret as significant, simply doesn't see what's actually happening underneath the calm surface he's observing. The second thing to understand is why this internal processing style develops specifically in someone with a super empath's particular combination of traits, because it's not accidental or random. It emerges directly from the same qualities that make her exceptional in the first place. Her deep emotional intelligence means she understands, often immediately, the full complexity of what a violation actually reveals about the person who committed it, without needing to work through that understanding via external confrontation first. Her genuine self-possession means she doesn't require external validation or reaction from the other person in order to trust her own assessment of what just happened. Together, these qualities mean she can arrive at complete, stable clarity about a violation's significance entirely internally, without ever needing to perform that clarity outwardly in order for it to be fully, completely real to her. The third thing worth understanding is what this internal processing actually produces over time, as a narcissist continues committing the same specific mistake repeatedly, testing and retesting boundaries based on the absence of visible reaction. Each violation, processed calmly and internally, rather than dramatically and externally, doesn't disappear or fail to register simply because it wasn't expressed loudly. It gets added with remarkable clarity and precision to an internal account that continues accumulating regardless of how calm her outward behavior remains throughout the entire process. This is precisely why, when a super empath finally does leave, the departure so often catches the narcissist completely off guard, feels sudden and unexplained from his perspective, when in reality, the departure was the culmination of a process that had been unfolding internally, invisibly, for far longer than any external signal ever revealed. The fourth thing to understand is why narcissists find this specific pattern so difficult to correct for, even when they've experienced its consequences before. Even when a previous relationship ended in exactly this same catastrophically surprising way. The difficulty lies in the fact that a narcissist's own psychological structure makes it genuinely challenging for them to model internal processing that doesn't announce itself externally, because their own emotional experience typically doesn't work this way. Narcissists tend to experience and express their own emotional states relatively immediately, relatively visibly, precisely because their sense of self depends on external validation and expression in order to feel fully real to them. This means they genuinely struggle to imagine, let alone accurately predict, an internal process happening in someone else that doesn't require external validation in order to be complete. And this fundamental gap in perspective taking is precisely what leads them to keep making the same catastrophic miscalculation, relationship after relationship, with different super empaths who all, eventually, process and depart in remarkably similar ways. The fifth thing worth understanding is the specific, particular danger of this miscalculation compared to other mistakes a narcissist might make in a relationship, because this one carries a uniquely permanent quality that many of their other errors don't. Most relational damage a narcissist causes can be, at least theoretically, addressed through the usual repair tactics we've discussed in previous conversations: apologies, love bombing, promises of change, the intermittent reinforcement cycle that keeps most partners genuinely uncertain about whether things might improve. These tactics work, to varying degrees, with partners whose trust erodes gradually and whose hope for reconciliation remains genuinely alive throughout the process. But because a super empath's internal accounting happens with such clarity and completeness before any visible sign of it emerges, by the time the narcissist notices anything has changed, the internal conclusion has often already fully solidified, already moved past the point where the usual repair tactics retain any real effectiveness. The mistake isn't just crossing a line. It's continuing to cross that same line repeatedly, mistaking silence for permission, right up until a conclusion that was reached calmly, privately, and completely finally becomes visible in the form of a departure that no longer responds to anything he still has left to offer. The mistake isn't just crossing a line, it's continuing to cross that same line repeatedly, mistaking silence for permission, right up until a conclusion that was reached calmly, privately, and completely finally becomes visible in the form of a departure that no longer responds to anything he still has left to offer. And this is exactly where I want to take the rest of our conversation, because understanding the mistake itself is only part of the picture. What happens after he finally recognizes what he's actually done, and why that recognition arrives too late to change anything, reveals something even more important about the true permanent cost of this specific miscalculation. The first thing worth understanding is what the moment of recognition actually looks like for a narcissist who's just realized, often with genuine shock, that the calm, patient partner he'd been quietly testing for months or years has arrived at a completely finished, completely stable decision to leave. This moment tends to unfold very differently from how he'd unconsciously expected departures to unfold, based on his experience with other partners whose leaving typically followed a more familiar, more negotiable pattern. Visible anger that could be soothed, hurt that could be addressed through the usual repair tactics, a threshold that, however serious, still felt like it existed somewhere within the realm of things he could influence if he applied enough effort. What he encounters instead, with a super empath who has finally reached her internal conclusion, is something categorically different. A decision that isn't actually negotiable, because it was never made in the heat of the moment he's used to working with. It was made slowly, deliberately, over an extended internal process he had no visibility into, which means by the time he's finally aware something is wrong, the entire negotiation window he's accustomed to relying on has already quietly, permanently closed. The second thing to understand is why his usual tools fail so completely and so quickly in this specific scenario, in a way that genuinely destabilizes him more than a typical departure would. The apology that normally works requires her to still be in the process of deciding whether to stay, and she isn't because that decision was already fully resolved before he ever offered the apology. The love bombing that normally works requires her nervous system to still be susceptible to the specific pull of intermittent reinforcement. And while some of that conditioning may linger, as we discussed in earlier conversations, her decision to leave was made from a place deeper than that conditioning could override. The promises of change that normally buy time require her to still hold genuine uncertainty about whether change is possible, and her internal accounting, built calmly and methodically over the entire relationship, has already provided her with more than enough evidence to answer that question definitively without needing to wait any longer to find out. The third thing worth exploring is what specifically makes this particular kind of loss so uniquely difficult for a narcissist to process compared to other relationship endings he's likely experienced throughout his life. With most departures, even painful ones, there's usually some narrative available that allows him to protect his sense of self. She was too demanding. She never understood him. The relationship simply wasn't right for either of them. These narratives, however inaccurate, provide a kind of psychological cushion, a way of absorbing the loss without having to fully confront his own role in causing it. But a super empath's specific kind of departure, precisely because it comes without dramatic accusation, without visible anger he can point to as evidence of her unreasonableness, without the kind of messy, emotionally charged ending that would let him construct a convincing narrative of her instability, leaves considerably less material available for this kind of protective reframing. Her calm, her clarity, her simple, unshakable decision to leave doesn't hand him anything to work with, which means the loss, in this specific case, is much harder to explain away using his usual defensive tools. The fourth thing to understand is what actually happens to his internal experience in the months following this specific kind of loss, because it tends to differ meaningfully from what we discussed in earlier conversations about narcissists moving on from more typical relationship endings. The absence of a satisfying protective narrative means the disturbance we discussed in an earlier conversation. The internal discomfort that exists beneath the surface, even when it doesn't translate into visible accountability, tends to be considerably harder to fully suppress in this specific scenario. He may find himself returning, more frequently than he'd like to admit, to specific memories of moments where her calm response to something he now recognizes, at least partially, as genuinely hurtful, sits differently in retrospect than it did in the moment he first observed it. This doesn't necessarily produce full conscious accountability. We discussed at length why that outcome remains unlikely even under significant pressure, but it does tend to produce a more persistent, more difficult to ignore undercurrent of unresolved discomfort than his other relationship endings typically leave behind. The fifth thing worth understanding, and this is perhaps the most important insight for anyone listening who might currently be the super empath in this exact scenario, is what her calm response actually represented throughout the entire relationship, in contrast to how the narcissist consistently misread it. Her calm was never evidence of low stakes. It was evidence of exactly the opposite. A depth of internal processing so genuine, so complete, that it simply didn't require external performance in order to be entirely real. This distinction matters enormously because so many super empaths in the aftermath of these relationships find themselves second-guessing whether their own calm demeanor throughout the relationship somehow contributed to being taken less seriously, whether they should have been louder, more visibly upset, more demonstrative in ways that might have prevented the repeated boundary violations they eventually had to leave over. I want to address this directly. The narcissist's failure to correctly read her calm as significant was never her responsibility to manage. It was his fundamental failure of perspective-taking, his consistent inability to imagine an internal processing style different from his own, and no amount of her performing more visible distress would have actually produced a different outcome, because the core mistake wasn't about her volume. It was about his own limited capacity to accurately model an inner world genuinely different from his own. I want to say something important here about what this entire pattern reveals about the specific power a super empath holds, power that often goes completely unrecognized by herself as much as by the narcissist who eventually loses her throughout the entire duration of the relationship. Her capacity to process hurt internally, to arrive at complete clarity without needing external validation or dramatic confrontation, isn't a weakness or a passivity that allowed the mistreatment to continue longer than it should have. It's actually a form of genuine strength, one that ultimately produces something the narcissist's own psychology genuinely cannot counter or manipulate. A decision once made that doesn't require his participation, his acknowledgement, or his agreement in order to become completely, permanently real. So picture this, the way we often close these conversations, not the dramatic confrontation the narcissist unconsciously expected, not a scene where his usual tools finally desperately get deployed in an attempt to reverse a decision he's only just discovered has already been made, but something quieter, something that reflects the actual understated power this ending genuinely carries. Picture him standing in the specific, disorienting confusion of realizing that everything he thought he understood about how this relationship worked was built on a fundamental miscalculation, one he'll likely spend considerable time trying to understand, without ever fully grasping the internal process that actually produced the outcome he's now facing. And picture her somewhere else entirely, having already moved through the calm, deliberate internal process that led her here, carrying forward not confusion, but clarity, not devastation, but a hard-won, permanently useful understanding of exactly what her own calm internal strength is actually capable of producing when it's finally, fully allowed to reach its natural, complete conclusion. Because that is the real, quiet, cinematic truth beneath everything we've explored today. The dangerous mistake a narcissist makes when he crosses a super empath was never really about underestimating her feelings. It was about underestimating an entire architecture of processing he simply didn't have the internal framework to imagine, let alone predict. He mistook her silence for permission, her calm for indifference, her patience for a limitless resource he could keep drawing from indefinitely. What he actually encountered, without ever fully understanding it while it was happening, was a mind quietly, deliberately, completely reaching its own conclusion, entirely independent of his awareness. A conclusion that, once fully formed, no longer needed his understanding, his agreement, or his permission in order to become the final, unshakable truth that ended everything he'd assumed. Right up until the very end, he still had time to fix.